We're happy to be here. It's been a long time coming. Gary and I have been working on this for a while and included some late-breaking updates that HITRUST put out over the last week or two. So we'll get started. This is our agenda for today. We're going to talk about the two different frameworks and compliance schemes. Specifically for HITRUST, we're going to talk about I1. We're not going to talk about R2 today. That's a different product offering by HITRUST. But we're going to stick with I1 today and then also talk about SOC 2. We'll talk a little bit about the readiness process, what it takes to become compliant, what a typical timeline looks like. We'll talk about best practices that we've seen in the field and what makes companies successful in implementing either or both of these. And then we'll do some rapid fire QA and highlight some additional resources. So without further ado, Gary, take us away. Let's talk a little bit about the framework.
Thanks, CW. Obviously, if you're here, if you think you might need HITRUST, you probably know that HITRUST stands for Health Information Trust Alliance. It was formed back, it went live back in 1996 to answer the question, are you HIPAA compliant? To have the answer, well, we have a HITRUST certification. So the latest, well, as of a year ago, they had released a new certification, and that was the I1. So the I1 is an implemented one-year assessment, which can result in a certification. So if a firm is being required by investors or customers, partners to have HITRUST certification, this is a good place to start if you haven't done anything like this yet. Like I said, it can result in a certification governed by the HITRUST Alliance. It's risk management and security framework. It's based on ISO 27001 and NIST 853. And so my hecklers don't give me too hard of a time. The ISO is the international standard to manage information security, published by the International Organization for Standards. And the NIST is a catalog of information security privacy controls published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So one is European-based, the NIST is US federal-based. We believe that the I1 offers a moderate level of assurance. More than just foundational controls, these dig a little bit deeper than just the real basic blocking and tackling that an organization needs, and really shows a commitment to information security. It's a moderate level of assurance with a certification.
So Gary, this is an annual assessment. Basically, the I1 you mentioned, I being implemented, 1 being 1 year. So this is something that companies that do want to adopt this framework, become compliant, go through the assessment to get a certification. They would do this on an annual basis. You also highlighted that it's a moderate level of assurance as opposed to what HITRUST would consider to be a higher degree of assurance in their R2 or risk-based product offering. But we're just talking I1 here. And I think part of the rationale for talking about I1 and comparing it to SOC 2 is there's more parity between I1 and SOC 2. It's a little bit more similar than the R2, which is a more robust risk-based approach. Gary, I know there's some late-breaking changes that came out, I think last week, and then was in a webinar this week with HITRUST. Specifically, do you have any thoughts on how controls have changed or number of controls have changed for I1? And then
Right.
I understand there's now a rapid recertification option in the even years.
Yeah, the rapid recert was of great interest to me. I think I shot you a slack during that presentation and said, hey, this is interesting. So their first release of the I1 had 219 controls. And what I noticed about that was there were a lot of controls that were implementation level 2, level 3, and even some very specific regulation implementation levels that would be not applicable to a lot of our customers. For the new version 11 I1, they've pared things down to 182 preset controls. But before you think, oh well, it's just 37 fewer, there's been a big change. From my initial review, there were no controls or requirement statements that were above an implementation level 1. What this means to you is all of the I1 preset controls would feed directly into a risk-based 2-year assessment. So there wouldn't be any wasted energy or wasted work the year before. If you're moving towards an R2, the risk-based 2-year assessment, all your work that you did in the I1 would be leveraged moving forward into the R2. So that makes a lot more sense. I think HITRUST describes it as streamlined. It all flows into the next assessment. The other thing that that CW mentioned was the rapid recert, and I guess the analogy would be to the interim assessment for a risk-based 2-year. They're gonna give you a sampling of controls across the 19 domains, and make a selection if you had some shortcomings, if you had a corrective action plan, a cap or a gap in your first year's I1, then they would want to see your progress on those. But then the number of requirement statements needed to assess for the rapid recert is greatly less. I don't know the exact number, but it looked like about 1/5 of the total required for the first I1. So there's leverage there if you want to move forward and continue with the I1 as you prepare for the R2. So that the second year would be a less rigorous exercise, but it would be a deeper dive or a return to the areas that your organization had challenges with to see, how your progress is being made.
Yeah, and I think this is one of HITRUST's best updates. I think, like paring back the I1 to be more relevant to more organizations, keeping it simple. Look, this isn't a high degree of assurance. This is a moderate degree of assurance. It's very achievable for most organizations. And the way that the example they gave was, all right, in year 1, you have 182 controls you need to implement and have assessed. In year 2, estimate is about 60. And then year 3, you go back to the full assessment. So basically in the even years, organizations are able to, really just confirm that the controls are still in place, operating effectively, but they're not being assessed over all 182. So a little bit of less of an audit burden in years, 2, 4, et cetera.
Right, and one thing to remember is that you can do the rapid recert only if you're continuing to test the same environment, the same scope, and nothing material has changed.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. All right, so we'll jump over onto the SOC 2 side. Today, Gary's representing the HITRUST side. I'm representing the SOC 2, so we'll have to see by the end what is the more attractive offering. So for SOC 2, I'll kind of juxtapose these. Kind of the way that we set up this slide is you can look on the left and kind of see the example there for HITRUST, and then on the right, similar attribute for SOC 2. For SOC 2, depending on the number of trust service criteria that an organization chooses, the baseline being security, you can expect about 75 unique controls. That's kind of an average, I would say. So that's a little bit different. The assessment or the examination for a SOC 2 it results in an audit opinion and a report. So that's different than a certification. So you might hear people say, I'm SOC 2 certified. It's like, well, it's not exactly correct. You got a successful SOC 2 report and a good audit opinion, but it's not a certification. For SOC 2, whereas HITRUST is governed by the HITRUST Alliance, SOC 2 is governed by the AICPA. That's the Certified Public Accountants organization in the US. So they put out the criteria for SOC 2, and then organizations design controls to meet those criteria. And then again, something to highlight, HITRUST describes itself as a risk management and security framework, and they do that by pulling in all these different other security standards and frameworks. As opposed to that, SOC 2 has a reporting framework. It's aligned with CISO 2013. They don't describe it as a security framework. It's a reporting framework, and some of the nuance there is one of the nice things about SOC 2 is you have the flexibility to design controls to meet the criteria. So the criteria are static. They're published by the AICPA. They're refreshed every so many years. The last big refresh was in 2017. And we often encourage our clients, take some time to work with your audit firm to design the controls so that, for your team, those controls are actually reflective of how you do business versus just being, generic controls that don't make sense for your organization. SOC 2 is an annual assessment. We'll kind of walk through some of the progression for SOC 2 compliance in a moment. And then I would describe SOC 2 as basic third-party assurance. So a lot of organizations, when they're getting their first or going through their first compliance initiative, often they're starting with SOC 2 because it's customizable. SOC 2, you get to define the scope being the infrastructure, software, people, processes, data. So that could be a business unit, it could be an entire organization. So because it's flexible and it's a little bit less of a burden than some of the other compliance schemes out there, often that's a good starting point. But just looking at the number of controls, you can look and say, well, HITRUST probably has a little bit of a higher degree of assurance just because you're assessing more things. So that is something to consider. Anything else on this slide, Gary, that you can think of?
So CW, tell me what SOC stands for.
Service and Organizational Controls. So, and that acronym has changed over the year, but the idea being that any service organization out there, whether you're a SaaS provider, whether you're, any kind of service organization, it doesn't necessarily have to be SaaS, but that's one of the biggest use cases that we see now is a lot of these, online platforms or service providers are being asked by their customers to demonstrate their security compliance. So if I want to do business with you, Gary, you say, okay, I'll do business with you, but I want to know how you're protecting my data. And SOC 2 is a good reporting mechanism to demonstrate that, hey, my environment has been designed in a certain way to secure your data. We have a third-party CPA firm that comes in and attests to that. So please do business with me. So it's a good third-party assurance mechanism.
So even though it's service organization controls, it could be a way to demonstrate your information security to your own board, or to show your C-suite what the information security department is doing to protect the assets.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, let me correct myself there. I think the service organization controls was actually the old acronym. Now we're saying system and organizational controls, which is more descriptive of kind of the direction the CPA wanted to take the SOC scheme.
Okay, so system and organization controls.
Yep. And then last point for each is for HITRUST. It's kind of a three-party relationship for those that aren't familiar with that. If you're the organization being assessed, you're going to engage HITRUST to subscribe to their platform. HITRUST is ultimately going to issue the certification, but the assessment will be done by a HITRUST certified external assessor. So Risk 360 is a HITRUST external assessor. We actually have to send our team down to get certified and maintain certification for the firm as well as individuals. And so we are authorized to do those assessments. So it is kind of a three-party relationship there. Whereas on the SOC 2 side of the house, you can see the assessment must be done by a CPA firm. We're also a CPA firm, which allows us to do both. HITRUST being an external assessor, SOC Reports being a CPA firm, and we'll get into some of that, the benefits of being able to do both when we talk about single framework strategy. So Gary, I'm gonna kick it over to you for the timeline here. I'll build the slide out, but could you walk us through, what is the process to get ready for a HITRUST I1, and what are some of the big takeaways here?
Right. So we would start off with a scope and planning session. We'd have meetings with not just IT, but some of the leadership at the organization that's looking to receive the certification and do the assessment. We would walk them through that process. We would stand up what's called a MyCSF in the HITRUST portal. That's their dynamic web portal for managing assessments. And it's where you can actually see which requirement statements you're going to be assessed against, which is often very different from their static CSF document, which is their HITRUST Common Security Framework. So they have a static security framework, but as you select an assessment, there's going to be different selections from that CSF that show up in the My CSF portal. So I call the portal the dynamic portal, where you're managing your assessment, and the other the static framework. They just released version 11 of the new static framework. It's got a lot of updated things that will help manage cybersecurity, information security controls, and then those are reflected in that version within My CSF. So this will help you, define the priorities, timeline, system scope, and define what success looks like. This is where you'll see the specific 182 controls that you'll be assessing to.
Yeah.
Then we'll do a gap assessment where we'll see, okay, based on these requirement statements, where does your organization line up? Make some detailed recommendations and validate the action plans, making sure that this is going to test the correct systems. Quite often it's a system that's internally designed by the organization that they want to do a HITRUST assessment for. It could be an entire organization, it could be one department, it could be down to one or a handful of software systems. Quite often it's the internally written piece of software that's the foundation for the organization. The other thing to keep in mind is controls must be in place for 90 days, and policies and process documentations have to be published and approved for 60 days prior to the assessment start.
So that's kind of one of the long poles in the tent. Like if you're backwards planning from when you need that certification, you need to plan, all right, well, I need to let the controls essentially bake for 90 days, right? So
yep.
We'll get into the timeline in a moment, but that's an important thing to note.
Yep, those things need to be in place. Then once we start the audit field work, we'll make an evidence request list. We'll stand that up in our own homemade GRC platform, Phalanx, and we'll provide that to the assessed entity, and they'll be able to provide evidence documentation and make notes in the system where we can communicate back and forth. But when we make notes in that system, everyone that's on the RIS 360 team, as well as their internal assessed entity team, can see the notes and see where things are moving and see where things are needed. This is where we report our audit testing, and we use that also for weekly status reporting. Then it comes to the reporting and certification portion. We submit the object to the HITRUST Alliance. That's done through the HITRUST MyCSF portal. And then a formal QA and report issuance comes from the HITRUST Alliance. One of the things that's interesting to me about the HITRUST process is it goes through at least 3 different sets of eyeballs. The initial assessor from, say, RIS 360 or your external assessor team, a QA within that assessor team takes a second look at it, and then thirdly, someone from HITRUST takes a very close look at these items. So anyone may come back and say, I'm not convinced that this score is appropriate. Please, provide more evidence, provide more detailed evidence, or give us an explanation. It usually takes 8 to 12 weeks after the audit is submitted, but sometimes it comes out sooner. So we'll talk more about the timeline here in a moment. Okay, so the initial part, and you're seeing a 12-month timeline. This is just an average, typical timeline. Your mileage may vary. It could take longer if your organization needs to mature their policy and process documentation and even implementation. So we'll start out in the first couple of months with a strategy and plan. During this time, we'll be doing a baseline review. We want to see if there's gaps, do a gap assessment, see where your gaps are, do a checklist for action items, and make sure that the organization can mature and move forward. In the next few months, we'll do a strategic roadmap. We'll have detailed recommendations for go forward action plan, define priorities, and determine what the requirements to move forward if we're meeting different regulatory requirements. The next few months, we'll be doing project management and advisory to oversee gap remediation, review existing and create policies, procedures, and process documentations required for the HITRUST I1 and roll out those policies. Now, something to denote, now the person that's doing the auditing is not the one making the recommendation for the policies and process documentations. There's kind of a, what would you call, kind of a garden wall between the two, so that we're not testing our own work.
Yeah, that's a good distinction.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that
time
on independence, but essentially, some companies have us, we'll come in, we'll actually do the implementation as well as the assessment, and HITRUST allows that as long as we're using separate teams. So, Gary, if your team is doing the implementation piece and maybe my team is doing the actual assessment, and that independence is a little bit more lax than the AICPA, which we'll kind of get into that on the SOC side, but part of that is because HITRUST is ultimately doing final QA and issuing the certification itself.
Yeah. During this time, if the organization doesn't have another service provider, we can provide penetration testing and vulnerability management. And then towards the end of the process, we'll do the initial HITRUST examination. That's a 90-day process. So we have 90 days to test and tweak what is provided as evidence. It's a point-in-time assessment over implemented system that's being measured, and upon report certification issuance, HITRUST I1 certification is valid for 1 year.
Yep, and Gary, you kind of mentioned this. I think a year is a good planning timeline, because the big unknown whenever we get into the gap assessment is, all right, how long is remediation going to take based on the number of gaps that come out of that? But I would say I've not seen any company do it in less than 9 months. And the reason being is, controls have to bake for 90 days. You need time to do that initial gap assessment. And then our assessment is a 90-day assessment. So you're it would really be, I think, infeasible to expect to be able to, go from 0 to certified in less than 9 months. So it can be done in 9 months, but I think a year is a more relaxed timeline, maybe more realistic.
Right, and from my experience, when you're changing policy and process documentation, quite often the policies have to be ratified by your board of directors, and they may have a quarterly or biannual meeting, and that may be the only time it can be ratified. So you've got to get those documents ready to go before the board.
Okay, great. So we'll jump over and kind of just do a similar summary. I'll kind of highlight some of the nuances that are different for SOC 2. And then after that, we'll get into some best practices. So SOC 2, a similar process. We start out with scoping and planning. We need to understand, all right, what is the information system that our clients want to define? Once that's solidified and we begin the planning process, we get into the gap assessment. We're going to find, issues. There's always issues or places where clients can improve. So we want to highlight those as well as the risk around those different areas that might be gaps. One of the key things that I always like to highlight during the readiness phase is for SOC 2, again, design the controls. That's when the company is designing the controls to meet the criteria. Since we do this on a daily basis, this is part of the collaboration between us and our clients, is getting a good set of controls that are going to be a good foundation for a security program that you can carry forward. The other piece is building the system description, which is going to be section 3 of the SOC report, which describes the information system, everything from overview of the company to overview of the solution to the different components of that. So that's something that we like to get started during readiness. One thing to note is, for SOC 2, there's 2 offerings. There's the type 1, which, if you're thinking about timeline of maturity, you're starting out with readiness. Type 1 is really your foot in the door for SOC reporting. That's a point-in-time assessment over just the design of controls and the fairness of presentation. So we're not doing statistical samples for a period of time. We're just looking at a sample of 1. So the controls do not have to bake for 90 days. So it is a little bit quicker turnaround on that. But then once you decide to get into type 2, that is not only design of controls and fairness of presentation, but also operating effectiveness of those controls over a period of time that has passed. So kind of the progression tends to be, you do readiness, type 1, you might do a 6-month type 2 just to get a type 2 report sooner, but then typically it becomes an annual exercise thereafter, not dissimilar to the HITRUST I1. See a few other nuances. A successful examination results in a clean, or what we call unmodified audit opinion from a CPA firm. All right, I'll jump into the timeline real fast. Key thing to note here is the timeline is just a little bit quicker. So depending on how ready the organization is, I mean, we can go from planning to readiness very quickly, and then depending on remediation, the burden of proof is a little bit less than for HITRUST because you don't have to wait those 90 days. So as long as every control has been implemented, we can see that it is, we can attest to that. The report is something that we can get out a lot quicker. So I've seen companies, go from 0 to report in hand within 6 months. Again, 9 months is probably a better timeline, just so you have time for remediation. You have time for organizational change, which is important when you're, setting a good foundation for a security program. You really don't want to rush it if you can help it. Often, if clients are beating down the door to get your SOC report, a lot of times you can just let them know, look, we're trying to do this right. It's going to take us X number of months. We can give you progress reports, and usually clients are amenable to that because they understand that good security sometimes takes time to implement. All right, so now we get into some of the fun things that we've observed over the years, Gary. So these are kind of a list of things that we see the most successful companies do. And we kind of built this list based on, all right, what's the minimum thing that you need to do to be successful? So I'd say like the first 2 to 3 things, very critical. If you do these things, whether it's HITRUST or SOC 2, you're going to be successful. And then as you progress, there's opportunities to mature. So let's talk about some of these. What do you think? What do you think about this one, Gary?
Yeah, assign the controls to a control owner. If someone doesn't have ownership of the control, you're going to have a mess. Quite often that's outlined in a process documentation, which is a high-level document that kind of goes hand in hand with your policy document that says who's responsible, what's their cadence of touching and managing this system or process, and how are we going to report on this. So implementations that are in place and working well are important, but the ability to be able to report on that is important as well. And quite often that will come down to the control owner, and it'll be a quicker turnaround trying to get that evidence if someone is familiar with what that's supposed to look like. I don't like to lead the witness when I'm asking for evidence on an item, quite often because they're going to have a different piece of software. They're going to have a different version. I don't want to send them a screenshot, but more often than not, I'm thrilled by what they return. But if I'm not, then we can work with the control owner to try to get the correct evidence.
Yeah, and I think people want to do the right thing in most scenarios, right? So if you let them know, hey, this group of controls, these are yours, you need to operate these, you're responsible for these, people are going to do that. It's often that they don't know to do that because the controls haven't been assigned. So making sure that there's good communication among the team solves a lot of the problems that we see in audits. The second kind of critical piece here is having an internal champion. So someone who's going to be accountable to owning the program. So the 2 things I like to say is you need an executive sponsor who's involved at some level, and then you need a project manager or somebody who's going to run the program and be the person that gets stuff done. And if you have those 2 things, then we see a lot of success. And one of the ways that you can kind of create that common operating picture for your team is to have a RACI matrix. So defining who's responsible for this, who's accountable for this, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed, and that helps to clarify roles for the information security program. So I think this is a best practice, and the companies that do that have a pretty high degree of success. I kind of jump the gun there, but yeah, having executive sponsor involvement is so key, because sometimes you know, it's a resource issue and you need someone to go to bat, you know, for budget for the team. So when you don't have an executive sponsor involvement, then often there's just there's going to be a mismatch or kind of a delta between expectations and, you know, what it takes to actually run a good program.
Exactly. It helps to have someone at that executive level to be the heavy and say, hey, you know, CW and Gary, they are actually our friends. They're helping us get this certification. They're not the bad guy, and I need you to respond.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about is communication early on needs to go, you know, obviously the IT team, the InfoSec team, the cyber, the network folks, the developers, they know there's an audit coming because they sit in those meetings, but HR may not know. Finance, you know, people that manage the contracts, even physical and environmental security, they may not know something's coming. I made a request of a subject matter expert one time, and they wisely responded, "This sounds like a fishing expedition. I'm not talking to you." And I said, "Great, you passed that test. Now you're going to get an email from the Chief Information Security Officer, and we'll talk later." So it helps to let everybody know, hey, this thing is coming.
Yeah, that's a good segue. I think, you know, part of preparing the team is doing, you know, quarterly spot checks, and you know, more mature or larger organizations may have an internal audit function that does this. You know, they're basically doing the pre-audit before the audit to make sure the team's going to be set up for success. In instances where, you know, resources aren't available or that department doesn't exist, you know, even just spot checking, you know, take a sample of controls every quarter, spot check, you know, talk to HR, talk to IT, talk to, you know, legal or whomever is in charge of operating those controls. Just make sure that they're tracking, make sure they're doing the things they're supposed to be doing, and that goes a long way toward making sure the program is effective. And then, you know, I'd say 1 through 4 are really critical. If you do 1 through 4, I think you're going to be successful. But, you know, if you want to take it to the next level, we recommend, you know, expand that common operating picture by using a GRC tool that all your stakeholders can log into, you know, see the controls that are assigned to them, you know, even do some of the things that they need to do within the tool. That way it's all there. So one of the things we've done over the past several years is develop, you know, Phalanx GRC, which is a tool that we use internally. It's also a GRC platform that we use to maintain our own compliance. As a firm, we are ISO certified to 27001, 27701, and 22301. So those initiatives, there's a lot of controls wrapped up with those 3 initiatives. And so the way we manage that across those frameworks is within our own tool, which we make free and available. So if you want to check out the link there, go to that, sign up. It is a great tool. Next, I'll just highlight our CEO, Christian Hyde's put together a great 5-part series on designing an information security program. This is a blog series where he kind of steps through, you know, everything from how to get an executive sponsor, how to put the budget together, what are the key hires. Highly recommend that for taking the program to the next level, and even just getting clarity on, you know, how to prioritize resources. All right, Gary, rapid fire Q&A. Let's see what we got. All right,
Okay.
we'll do this and then we'll open it up for any questions that we have from our audience today. All right, top 3 barriers to success. What are some of the ones that you see out there?
Barriers. Well, we addressed a lot of those in the previous slide, where, you know, having executive support, having the controls assigned to the right people. You know, obviously you've got your whole reason for having your HITRUST certification or your SOC 2 compliance. Is that compelling enough to develop a budget? Can you develop a project plan and have someone internally manage this and move it forward? You know, those are some I think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think another one that comes to mind is just communication. It's often said, you know, you can't over communicate. And one of the ways I think practically that this is done well is, you know, before the audit, there's an all hands meeting, you know, to talk about timeline, these are the weeks that we're doing observations. This is what the auditor is going to be looking for. This is the deadline to get evidence submitted. Just getting on the same page actually goes a long way, just to helping everybody then go back to their day to day, and also get those things done that they need to in the right timeline. So I think that's another one. All right, is it possible? Oh, go ahead.
Part of that communication can involve colorful graphs, which Phalanx helps us to produce and helps to track metrics. People just often want to see like a red light, green light, yellow light report and say, okay, yeah, I feel good about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Getting that like weekly status update to the team, so they're tracking like, hey, are we going to make it? Are we on track? What do we need to kind of surge resources for? That's a good point. All right, so is it possible to do one audit and obtain HITRUST certification and a SOC 2 report? If so, what does it look like? So we've had the pleasure of doing this a few times now, and as long as you're working with an external auditor who is also a CPA firm, this can be done. It is a little bit complex, but it's something that's worth navigating the complexity, because it makes a really good experience for you as the assessed entity. So Gary, any thoughts on like best practices, or kind of how we've approached this?
Well, of course, a lot of the controls are going to be managed through your GRC tool, which of course we offer Phalanx, and that can help report, collect once and report many.
Right.
It can be used by the SOC team as well as the HITRUST team to assess a particular control, and quite often divide up the work and let us move through the process more quickly. We can tag the different requirement statements for HITRUST versus SOC 2, and have conversations with the subject matter experts for that.
Yeah, I think the best way we've done this for our clients is we do a lot of internal planning before we even talk to the client, in terms of like timelines. But we'll already identify 2 teams. We'll create that single request list. So from a client perspective, when you're being assessed, you have one request list, just focus on that. And then if there's additional request lists for other frameworks, what we'll do is we'll close those redundant requests so that you're providing stuff once, and then both teams on our side are able to go in there and use that evidence. And there's some nuance, with HITRUST and SOC 2, such as sampling requirements and things like that, but we've taken care of that on the back end. So the nice thing is, getting 2 reporting or certification / reporting mechanisms out of one audit saves a lot of effort on the entity being assessed. It also has efficiencies for us as an audit firm, because we can approach it at one time, do a single set of observations to cover 2 frameworks. So that is definitely something for firms that have to do more than one compliance initiative. Definitely try to streamline that if you can. We got a blog on how we approach single framework strategies, so check that out. All right, next one is scope is a primary driver of cost and effort, both internally and for auditors. How can I assess my scope? So Gary, I know with like HITRUST R2, scope is highly, well, the number of controls is directly correlated to the specific scope. I know with I1, we're talking about, well, every scope has the same number of controls. With SOC 2, it kind of depends on the trust service criteria that you want to add, if any, to security as a baseline. What are some thoughts here as far as scoping? Like, what is HITRUST look at?
Well, like you said, CW, the scope for an R2, which is the risk-based 2-year assessment, is going to depend on the size of the organization, number of records. If it's a clinical organization, number of physicians practicing, number of hospital beds, things like that. But the I1 is designed to feed into any of those scenarios. So of course, initially HITRUST was healthcare oriented. Now they're getting into everything from hospitality, higher education, finance. But the I1 is designed to feed into and streamline your process to get you ready for that step. So the scope is more going to be tuned to which software system are you going to be assessing, system or systems, division or divisions, or the entire organization. It's probably best to start with one system most likely your internally developed piece of software to narrow your scope as much as possible for your first trip through the I-1.
Yep, that's a good point. One of the other things I would mention too, a little bit behind the curtain, from an audit firm perspective, is some of the primary drivers of effort for us are number of systems in scope and number even of cloud service providers in scope. Because if a SaaS solution is hosted on multiple cloud service providers, we do need to assess all those providers and consider, in a shared responsibility model, what is the nuance for each of those? So that can get, quite complex pretty quickly. Yeah, that's
right. I'm glad you brought up the cloud service providers. The large ones typically have their own HITRUST assessment, which can be referenced and brought into the client's report.
That's a great point. So there is this idea of inheritance with HITRUST, where you can basically inherit controls that service provider is operating on your behalf, and that's done through the MyCSF platform. Similarly with SOC 2, we call it something different. We call it subservice organizations. So those are essentially vendors that are operating security controls on your behalf. But similarly, we're able to, if that's something that's going to be considered as part of the SOC examination, we'll essentially inherit those controls from those cloud service providers. We'll take a look at their SOC reports or other kind of reporting mechanisms that they have available to validate that, yes, they are operating those controls on behalf of the client. All right, let's see. How has the market shifted for HITRUST over the past few years? So maybe most specifically to I-1, what are some of the nuanced changes that happened within the last week for I-1?
Well, of course, the I-1 was born out of a need for more of an entry level or a moderate assurance rather than a high level or gold standard assurance, just to get your toe in the water and get you moving with the HITRUST process. In that introduction in the first year, HITRUST learned that they needed to adjust those the controls and center it more to move people into the R2. Of course, HITRUST itself has shifted from strictly healthcare into other market spaces to become more of an agnostic certification of information security, compliance or standards.
Yeah,
they've moved a lot of the industry standard items to a checkbox so that you can attest to things like a CCPA, GDPR, HIPAA, CMMS, things like that, or choose not to if you're more of an industry agnostic test.
Yeah,
that's come through the different versions of version 9, and it's pretty firmly baked into version 11.
The only other thing I'd mention for just for anybody that's already has an I-1 or is going through the I-1 process, the prior versions of the I-1 are going to be deprecated in April. So if you're in that process, you might look at going to version 11 for the I-1. For R2, previous versions are still fine for a while. There is a deprecation schedule that we'll probably get to in a different webinar, but just so we're tracking that. We already talked about independence, so I'm going to skip that just to leave room for some Q&A. All right, Gary, tell me something good. What do you got?
Well, like I've said before, the I-1 is now streamlined to lead you straight into an R2. There's not a lot of wasted effort and time when you're doing that. It's like I said, moderate level of assurance. It's a great place to start to prove your commitment to information security, and it's a well recognized brand name that people know. In fact, there's a lot of confusion as to, well, HITRUST, that's a federal thing. No, you're thinking of HIPAA.
Yeah,
but it's a name that's been out there since 1996. It's a well trusted and tested process that they have developed.
Great. I guess Nick, Corey, if you're on the line, are any questions that we have from any of the viewers today that we want to try to answer?
Yeah, we actually have several. Some of you guys have similar questions, so I've actually answered them and sent it out to the whole group. Giving out the URL for phalanx.com if you want to sign up to start helping manage your SOC 2 program with our Essentials free program. We also have other tiers that are paid that gives you a little bit more access. So you can take a look at the website and find the best one for you. Also, the blog series that CW discussed, I sent out the link to that. So if you guys are interested in reading it, you can find it there. We actually have published a budget template as well. So you can find that on our website. So I'll get to the questions. So I think this is for Gary and for HITRUST. To clarify the rapid research, does it mean that it's less controls in the even years?
It does. I think CW had the exact number. There are fewer controls that are assessed in the odd years or the off years, the second years. It's a, like I said, it's a rapid process where you're not having to attest to as many controls, but they will make you take a second look at things that had a gap or a cap. Cap being corrective action plan, where the implementation level fell below the accepted score for a passing score. Items in the I1 are typically scored at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, and 0. So we kind of do a metric on that, consult the HITRUST scorecard and see where should this fall. That's going to determine if you see these things again. And so, but also it's going to put them higher up on your, risk register or your list of things to do to focus on for the next year. But yes, that got my interest very much during the webinar last Tuesday, and I messaged CW, hey, this is going to make it more attractive because your second year iteration will be less of an effort, maybe even a lower effort than another SOC 2 report. There may be fewer controls there.
And it really depends on those factors that they put out in the webinar. You mentioned some of them, Gary. I think it could be as little as 60 controls. It could be more depending on caps, and if things are assessed as not being in place, then the number might go up. But I think they were trying to make it similar to the R2, which is year one very heavy, year two just a sample, pretty light. It's not the same, but I think they kind of took that same thought into it. They said, what if we reduce the effort in year two? And that was kind of their late breaking change that they made.
Yeah.
All right, so our next question is related to HITRUST as well. How does the 90-day in place and 60 days to test fit into the 12-month timeline?
So
more clarification.
Right, good, excellent question. So the controls implementation, so is the firewall in place and operating? Is multi-factor authentication in place and being used? Those implementation controls need to be in place for 90 days before the beginning of the assessment period. And the assessment period itself is 90 days. So you need to roll that back and say, we need a certification by this date. We need to have our assessment certified. We need to be submitted by a date before that. We need to start the audit, the assessment period, 90 days before that. We'd better have our controls in place and operating 90 days before that date. And then the documentation. So in an R2, HITRUST would measure policy and process. In the I1, you would think that they're not measuring that, but you're going to have to take a look at your policy document to see if your policies are being met by the implementation. My latest saying is, a good policy statement without implementation is a work of fiction. A good implementation of a security control without a policy to back it up is vigilantism, and your CEO is going to wonder, why are you doing that? What gave you the control? So while the I1 really measures implementation, it's going to have to take a look at the policy and see what's your authority to do that. So don't be lulled into complacency with that. But it's not going to, we're not necessarily going to check the policy and see if it's been in place for 60 days, but we're going to want to know, hey, is this based on your current policy?
So an example would be, we in a gap assessment, we might identify, hey, there's no antivirus on user endpoint devices. That's a problem. All right, so let's say you implement it tomorrow. We need to wait 90 days before we can assess the controls around that, because it's got to be in place for 90 days. So, that's where, we'll put a tentative project plan together based on kind of the initial goals of our client, but then we are always adjusting that after the gap assessment, because what falls out of the gap assessment will always kind of impact that timeline. Typically, it's shifting to the right a little bit, and that's just something that's very normal.
Yeah,
Right.
so I'm sorry.
Typically for that 90 days, we're looking for, we may want to see evidence of log records. Quite often we'll ask for 12 months worth of logs, and then we'll take a sample from that. If you only have 90 days worth of logs, our sample is going to be smaller, but we're definitely going to want to see 90 days worth of logs. You implement these security controls for a couple of reasons, primarily to make your information more secure, but also so that you can attest to these requirement statements in an assessment. Hey, show me your stuff, prove that you're doing what you say you're doing. And that's where a lot of this comes down within a HITRUST assessment.
Okay, so we have an additional question around HITRUST too. Are the 182 preset controls published somewhere, or do you have to start the process to even see them?
Yeah, it's kind of like Fight Club. You don't know about Fight Club. You can't talk about Fight Club because it's registered. It's copyrighted information, so you kind of have to buy a ticket to get into the tent to see what's on the list. But suffice to say, it's table stakes plus, and these are based on what's their new term for cybersecurity and information security. It's very current types of controls. I'm missing a word, but they're based on current measures, not something antiquated from 10, 12 years ago.
The one thing I know HITRUST does allow is organizations can go to the HITRUST Alliance. They can, you have to fill out a form, but you can download, the CSF. I don't know if they've released the I1 updated 182 controls for public consumption. As assessors, as assessed entities, we have access to these. But if they have released it, I know it was a late breaking change and they just published it, or the webinar for this week. So if it is available, it is on the HITRUST Alliance site. You just have to fill out a form in order to download that.
Right. The CSF that CW is referring to is what I call the static framework document. Now, not every implementation level 1 requirement statement is going to show up in your I1, but it's going to be a pretty fair sampling. The static framework document has 13 different categories, but the MyCSF has 19 domains. So some of them look one for one, and some of them cross from one to the other. That's where having that, having a MyCSF subscription gives you some leverage towards seeing what you're going to be scored on.
Yeah, that does help for sure.
Okay, cool. So the next question is, does having a SOC 2 Type 2 report help achieve HITRUST I1?
That's an interesting question. I would say yes, because if you have a SOC 2 Type 2, you already have a pretty decent baseline set of security controls, and those are going to be able to map to those I1. But the thing to remember is, the SOC 2 threshold is lower. We're talking about 75 unique controls for security versus 182. So, it might get you a part of the way there, but most likely if this is your first endeavor going down the I1 route, there's probably going to be some controls that are, more in depth, more technical, more granular that you may not have implemented yet. So it's definitely a good start, but there's probably still a delta to be looked at.
Okay, so the next question is, can I choose to stay with HITRUST I1 indefinitely, or do you eventually have to go to R2?
It's a great question. You don't. I mean, HITRUST would like to tell you you should, you should mature, you should kind of, the way they've redesigned version 11 now is you can start small and kind of work your way up. But yeah, you can continue to do I1 if there's not a customer requiring it. HITRUST is not going to require it. And part of the reason they publish the I1 is because a lot of these big health plans are forcing their vendors to get HITRUST certified, but the R2 is just too massive for smaller companies to implement. So they said, well, I1 is a better balanced approach. It's still rigorous, but it's not, high degree of assurance. It's a moderate degree. So what I often, Gary and I both recommend this is if you don't have to do an R2, go with the I1. It's going to be easier for your organization to implement and operate those controls. 182 controls is a good number of controls. It's easier to manage versus the R2, which depending on your scope, that could blow up to 350, 500, 600 controls. And unless you have a large organization with a big team, that's very difficult for 2 people to manage that number of controls. Anything else on that, Gary?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, we have even more questions coming in. I know we're almost at time, guys, so I think some of them we might be able to reach out to you separately and maybe set up some calls to get a little bit more information for you. We have one last one that we can get to in our time frame. It's not quite related to SOC 2, but is there any mapping documentation between HITRUST and ISO?
HITRUST and ISO. So within, I know we have access to that within my CSF. You can kind of see the origin of HITRUST, or the origin of all the HITRUST requirement statements. There's not a public version of that, to my knowledge. There are some publicly available mappings, like the AICPA publishes mappings for SOC 2 to ISO, SOC 2 to other things. But because the CSF is proprietary to HITRUST, they do keep that under wraps. Any thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, like you said earlier, if you sign up on the HITRUST website to get a copy of the CSF, and that again is the static framework, it does have crosswalks within each requirement statement to applicable frameworks. Quite often NIST, ISO 27001, you'll see some towards CMMS and HIPAA. You'll see CCPA, GDPR, other privacy regulations. So if you do, sign up and get your copy of that PDF, and of course I would recommend you get the newest version 11, which is going to be more current. You can see those mappings, but you're going to do a lot of reading to get there, or do a lot of search and find within the PDF document.
All right, we're at time, but we have one question that I kind of want to ask. That's in the chat. Like, if they want to work with Risk 360, like, what's the process of getting in front of us to have a conversation?
Sure. So the easiest is just go to our website, reach out. A lot of our content is freely available. Some of it is just, I think there's a form that you fill out to get access to it. You can also hit us up on LinkedIn. We're very active on YouTube as well. So any other suggestions, Corey, that you'd throw out there?
Yeah, just visit the website. We actually have a local telephone number if you want to give us a call, talk to our sales team, or fill out to contact us. If you do that, it'll notify the marketing and sales department, and we'll get some time set up with you to figure out if we can help you with your HITRUST and SOC 2 needs.
Perfect.
Cool.
Well, thank you all for joining.
All right, you guys have a great day.
Thank you.